Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. We come together this morning. The idea for the talk, the idea is this seeming paradox of desire and no desire, desire and no desire. So on the one hand, we're told, don't start on the spiritual path unless you desire God as much as you would desire a pond if your hair was on fire. You must really want this. You must be committed to it. I mean, think about the analogy. What would you do if your hair were on fire and you wanted a pond? Would you let anything stop you? Would fences stop you? Would a thicket stop you? Would distance stop you? Nothing would stop you. This is something that you are totally committed to. You would have. And on the other hand, the other end of the spectrum, we are told that in order to experience God, we must be absent of all desires, even the desire to know God. It seems that even this desire to know God is kind of pushing us away from God or keeping us from the fullness of the experience. So we get these two seemingly conflicting messages, and it's a paradox that we must work through as we move along on our spiritual journey, as we move through our spiritual development. Right? And Dr. Holmes asks us to consider the way that the books of the Bible, as we have it here in our country, as it is laid out. And we start with the book of Genesis, and there's a unity there. There's a oneness there. Adam and Eve are walking in the cool of the evening with God. There's an intimacy there. And then comes this idea of separation. This idea that because they desired the knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil, they were cast out of that garden, out of that intimacy. They were separated from that experience. And then through all of the different stages, through all of the different phases of the Bible, we're kind of going through the growth of the soul, the back and the forth of the growth of the soul. Sometimes it's, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, to the revelation of the Christ within, the presence of God within us, right here and right now. And then eventually, the story, which is our story, which is each and every one of us, our story, it culminates with the revelation, with the experience of the presence of God, the actual experience of the presence of God. So I invite you to think of that as a journey, as a progression, as an evolution of our soul for however long it takes, whether it be here on this earth in this one lifetime, or wherever we go next, or started wherever we were before. But there's this progression that we're all going through. And I think sometimes it helps us to understand that we are on a progression, we are moving, we are changing, and sometimes we do go 3 steps forward and we go 2 steps back. But it's a progression that we are looking for. It is the progression that we hope to realize. So we have this paradox then, where on the one hand we're told you must desire God as much as you would desire to have a pond if your hair was on fire, and on the other hand we are told you must be absent of all desires. And somehow on this path, somehow you and I have to reconcile that. Right? So I put a quote in the email last night from F. Scott Fitzgerald, and I'm gonna restate it as best as I can remember it. I'm not exact here, but close enough for horseshoes. And he said, it is the test of a fit mind to be able to hold 2 opposing thoughts at the same time and still maintain the ability to function, I don't know what the context is. I don't know what he was referring to when he was talking about that. But certainly it's true. You know, we see this in our culture, in our pop culture today, in our society. It becomes very polarized, and people are off on one side of the polarity, or they're off on the other side of the polarity, and they can't seem to function. They can't find a middle ground that says, well, you know, there's two different views of this, and we can still go on. It's a battle almost, a war. You know, you have to come around to my way of thinking, or you're wrong, and we need to defeat you. That kind of defeatist attitude that we see exhibited in the extremes in our culture. And it's not just here in the United States, it's all around the world. You can see it in warring factions all around the world. This idea that I am right, you are wrong, my way is the right way, my way is the only right way. And there's no compromise. To talk to someone who does not share the same views that I share, well, that's just, you know, that's just capitulation. We can't even talk to these people, you know. We see it over and over and over again. So what that illustrates, or what that demonstrates, is that level of consciousness, that mindset, cannot entertain, or does not want to entertain, maybe it can but it won't, does not want to entertain two possibilities, two opposing possibilities, and examine them to see how each might be true in its own way. And it can't function with the paradox. So what it tries to do is it tries to eliminate the paradox by defeating the idea it does not agree with. Now you remember we're given a parable from the East of the four men who could not see, who found an elephant. And the one had the trunk of the elephant, and he says, you know, the elephant is like a big snake. And the other had the leg of the elephant, and he says, no, he says, the elephant is like a big tree trunk. And another was leaning against the side of the elephant. He says, no, he says, an elephant is like a big strong wall. And the last one had the tail of the elephant. He says, no, 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 you're all wrong. The elephant is like a rope. Now, each one was correct according to his own position, according to what was available to him at the time. And yet none of them had the whole picture. None of them could see the entire elephant. So what we want to consider then is that take the men at the two ends of the elephant, you know, they might easily, in the mindset of my way is the right way and the only right way, they might easily get into an argument. No, it's a snake. No, it's a rope. No, it's a snake, you idiot. You know, and kind of a shouting match going back and forth. So I just invite you to consider that on the spiritual path, we often come to these seeming paradoxes, these things that seem to contradict one another. You must desire to know God as much as you would desire a pond if your hair was on fire, and you must have no desires whatsoever or you'll never experience God. And we have to recognize that each is correct from its position, from its point of view, but there is a bigger picture. There is a higher picture. There is something, someplace where they come together. You know, so we're studying Joseph Selby's The Physics of God in our Wednesday night group now, and we're talking a lot about quantum physics and all of those things. And physicists are looking for the theory of everything, the TOE, the theory of everything. You know, so how can it be that Newtonian physics is correct and quantum mechanics is correct? How Newtonian mechanics and quantum mechanics, how can they both be correct? And they're looking for, well, maybe there's this theory above them, this theory that unites them, and that would be the theory of everything. Is there a theory where everything suddenly comes to make sense? So I invite you, when you're faced with a paradox, to consider that each position makes sense from where it is viewed, but there is likely a higher position where the two come together. the two unite and the two come together and the two are really not not in conflict. They were only seemingly in conflict because of where each of the viewers was, the position that each was in at the time. So we're faced with similar paradoxes as we go through our spiritual growth. You know, here we have this concept that God is perfect unity, God is perfect oneness, God is whole, God is complete. There's nothing ever lacking within God. There could be nothing lacking. And there can be nothing in God that contradicts God. If God contradicted itself, it would annihilate itself, right? Omnipotence in conflict, annihilating itself. So we have this philosophical idea of what this thing called God is: perfect unity, perfect oneness, perfect wholeness, omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, all of these other words and terms that the philosophers and the theologians give to us. And that might be the big picture that we really can't get our mind around, you know. Who understands? Who amongst us can possibly understand what omnipotence is? Who can understand what omniscience is? So we don't quite comprehend it. It's more of a theory, like the theory of everything. It's more of a theory, but we don't quite comprehend it. Yet out of this oneness comes multiplicity, comes many, you know, kind of the opposite of e pluribus unum. And in this case, out of one comes many. So we have this one, but it is expressing itself through its creation of many different people, many different species, many different planets, many different galaxies. And yet the totality of all of that is some part of the whole. Not all of the whole. You know, we understand, or our intellect tells us that there's way more out there that we don't know than we do know. But everything that is there is somehow part of this whole. And then you come up with the idea that when this unity, when this unformed energy, when it comes into the existence as matter, when the energy becomes a particle, it always comes in pairs, and it comes in pairs of opposites. So they can do the experiments in the large cyclotrons, the colliders. And when these things come in, they come in pairs of opposites. So the unity is now expressing itself as duality. And the duality has completely opposite characteristics. And yet what the scientists are telling us is if you do something to change the characteristics of one, then the characteristics of the other automatically change without regard to how far apart they might be, at distances that defy communication between the two at the speed of light. So we have this paradox, you see. Out of the one comes two, the two have, and the one is consistent, and the two appear to be in opposition, at least in terms of characteristics, and yet somehow they are still linked together. Somehow they are still linked together. So how does the one become two? You see? Why does the one become two? These things become the deeper questions that I don't even pretend to have a clue as to what the answer might be. But it just illustrates that if we look at one or we look at the other particle, we only see a certain point of view. But when we get back to the unity, when we get back to the singularity, when we get back to the oneness that is God, somehow it all fits. Somehow it all makes sense. If we look at human life, or if we look at the life of the plants and the animals, you know, we have this concept of God which is oneness. And yet here we have male and female. Out of that which is neither male nor female, and both male and female, we have two. We have two. So out of the one, again, we have two, but then it takes those two to come together to make another one. So we kind of look at this and we say somehow the apparent duality of the male and the female are just two different aspects of the one. We have the idea then that this thing that we call God could never be against itself, and yet we have the appearance of evil. So how could that which is we would call good create that which we would call bad? And is God really good or bad? Or neither good nor bad? Or just is? Right? And I think we have to understand that that which we call evil or that which we call bad is not life-affirming. And God is always life-affirming. But evil does not exist as an entity or power or even as a part of God. It is simply an experience where the presence of God is temporarily blocked or appears to be blocked. So think of it as a shadow. Think of it as sunlight and shadow. The shadow is not real. The shadow only exists due to the appearance of the light being blocked, but the light is still there. God is always good. God knows nothing of that which we call evil. So I'm just tossing these examples out just as kind of evidence that as we grow on our spiritual path, we keep running into these things that seem to contradict one another. And we have to say, well, how can this be? How can this contradiction be? And I invite you to keep in mind that they can be because you have to move through them. You have to be able to entertain the two opposing ideas and still be able to function. And you have to recognize that there is a higher truth, a higher principle that is at work, that you must keep these two seemingly opposite ideas, you must keep them in suspension in your mind, in your intellect, as you continue on your path and move to a higher place, to a higher understanding, to a higher experience, where the illusion of the duality is now gone. It is now gone. So what I'm saying is, don't get too excited. Don't get too hung up on trying to resolve the appearing opposites, because they're only temporary anyway. They're only conditions, and we want to move, as the Buddhists might say, to the unconditioned mind. So a couple of weeks ago we talked about how Dr. Bales was using the example of the development of a human baby in the womb, and just how perfect everything happens according to a perfect timeline. Everything happens as it should. Cells divide, cells multiply, cells become bones, cells become eyes. Something is guiding that process, and that something does not abandon us when we are born. And now I want you to think today about the development of a child. So the baby is born, and the baby cannot roll over. It has to stay in whatever position it is laid down in the bassinet, And of course we go over every couple of hours, and we roll it over, we put it in a different position. And there comes a time, where you can see it wiggling and moving and kind of trying to lift its little head up so it can see what's going on. And then there comes the magical day where it rolls over. It rolls over for the first time. How wonderful is that? You put the baby in the bassinet on its stomach, and you go over a little while later and it's on its back. What caused it to desire? See, what caused it to desire to do that? And in doing so, it's developing its little muscles. It's developing its locomotion. And it's just perfect. See, it's just perfect because there's something, some intelligence that is guiding that movement. And then it uses its little arms kind of in a half push-up, you know, to pick its head up so it could see outside the bassinet, see what's going on. And in doing so, it develops the strength of the upper body. And then one day you look and it's on its knees and it's on all fours, you know. It got up, it's trying to move. It's something within it is pushing it forward. It's trying to move, you know. And then maybe it plops right down on its face, totally unaffected by the fact that it just plopped down, you know. It doesn't, I love it. I just love it because the little one doesn't sit there and say, what was that? You know, what did I do wrong? Is God punishing me? God pushed my face down to the floor here, you know? Am I not smart enough to know how to do this? And all of the things that, can you imagine that we as adults, when we go out and we try to do something new for the first time, if it doesn't work out right, we start beating ourselves up, you know, instead of just continuing on towards the goal. So someday after being able to push itself up on its hands and its knees, the little one will start to crawl, you know. And this is an important part of its development. You can't take that away from them. It's important. We had classes. We had someone who would come and rent the center in Durham who taught classes for adults, and it was on movement. And the idea was that if we didn't spend enough time as babies crawling, you know, which some kids don't. They want to get right up and they want to walk right away. But if we don't spend enough time in that crawling stage, the parts of our brain that get linked together when the baby is developing, they don't fully develop. And this workshop was a movement workshop for adults, and it was teaching adults how to go back and mimic those same moves that babies would make when they're crawling, you know. To put an opposite arm and leg out at the same time, in order to help the adults go back, if you will, or in retrospect, go back and to develop those parts of the brain that could have developed more when they were children. Now, I don't know the science behind that. I don't know that I've explained it properly. But my point is that crawling is an important stage of development that you can't just skip by. And then, of course, after the child crawls for a while, it starts pulling itself up on furniture and things that it can grab onto, the coffee table and those sorts of things. And it starts to walk. And it starts to walk, you know, with support, holding its little hands on something until it goes out and it gets out in the middle of the floor. And the little knees start to wiggle a little bit and it drops on its bottom. And again, it doesn't sit there and say, what was that? What in the world was that? It just kind of rolls over into the crawling position, crawls right back over to something, pulls itself back up again. And then the child spends time learning how to walk. And then after that, it learns how to run. Now, it would be completely ridiculous for someone to look at the child who's learning how to crawl and say, why are you wasting your time with that? Don't you understand that running is what it's all about? You need to get up and run. What you're doing there is wrong. What you're doing is not going to get you to your goal. You need to get up and you need to run. And it would be equally ridiculous for someone to look at a child who's capable of running and saying, what are you doing? Don't you know that you need to crawl? Crawling is the thing. Crawling is the way to go. Crawling is what we're supposed to do. Get down on your hands and knees and crawl. And my point with that is that this is the two different points of view. Running is appropriate at certain times. If you're playing sports, you know, if you're outside having fun, running is appropriate. Crawling is appropriate at certain times when your body is developing, when your brain is developing. it's totally inappropriate to tell somebody who's in the stage of developing that they need to run, and it's totally inappropriate to tell somebody who has already developed through that stage that they need to go back and do more of that, because the person telling them is still in that stage, still in the stage of crawling. So where I'm going with that, when we look at development along the spiritual path, if we look at desire and no desire, they are two qualities that exist in different stages of our development. Two qualities that exist at different times, So what happens to people sometimes is we start on the spiritual path, and there's no shortage of advice. There's no shortage of books and tapes and opinions and people who will tell us what to do. And the message can be very confusing if we don't understand that each person is telling us from their own experience, from their own background, from their own education, but more importantly, from their own position on the path, from their own spot on that path. But their spot on the path is their spot. And you and I, we have to know where we are. We have to know, are we in the crawling stage? Are we in the walking stage? Or are we in the running stage? So if someone is on the point of the path where the desire to know God, as much as they would desire a pond if their hair was on fire, if someone is at that stage, then desire is what is good for them. I'm going to talk about desires and good desires and things that aren't so good for us. But it's okay. Now, for someone who is truly at the point in their progression where they have emptied themselves of all desires, then that is okay. That is what is appropriate and what is right for them. Now, for someone who is at that point, to tell someone at the beginning, you're doing it wrong because you should have no desires. See, that would be bad advice. For someone who's at the beginning to look at someone who has no desires and say, well, you're doing it wrong because you need to desire God as much as you desire a pond if your hair was on fire, well, that would be inappropriate. And I would just like to add that someone who has truly reached the point where they're absent of desire would not tell someone at the beginning, you need to be absent of desire, you're doing it wrong. Because once we have reached that stage in development, we understand that the other stages are not only appropriate, but they are necessary. They are necessary. So just, excuse me, I'm going to get a little sip of something to drink here, and then we'll continue. So just like the person who rented our center and came in and taught movement workshops under the theory that people didn't spend enough time in a certain phase of childhood development, and they needed to go back and kind of redo that work, we have to understand that each stage of the spiritual path, each stage of our growth, each milestone, if you want to call it that, along the journey, is absolutely necessary, is absolutely important. So rather than us go around trying to tell everybody else what they need to do, because that's not up to us, that's up to them, and rather than everybody else coming to us and telling us what we need to do, because that's not what we need to do, that's what they need to do, it is incumbent on each and every one of us to figure out where we are, to figure out what is appropriate for me today. Excuse me, what is appropriate for me now. So just a couple things along the way. Remember, if for everybody who's read Think and Grow Rich, Napoleon Hill said, desire is the starting point of all achievement. Desire is the starting point of all achievement. Now, he was very definitely coming from the beginning stages of the path. You got to want it. You got to want something. And he went on to say it wasn't just enough to want it. You had to flame that desire into a white hot flame. You had to want it more than anything. You had to want it, and you had to know what you were going to do to get it, what you were willing to do to get it, and you had to have plans, and you had to have things to do, and you had to go and you had to do those. And that's what his whole method is about. The beginning point. Now we might say in the beginning point of our spiritual journey, what we come to recognize is that, as the Buddhists might say, grasping an aversion, right? That there's something kind of missing. There's something kind of missing from our lives. It might be better health. It might be better prosperity. It might be loving relationships. It might be fulfilling work. Or it might be the appropriate spiritual path for us, or spiritual teaching, or spiritual practice, or spiritual community. But there's kind of this absence, if you will. There's kind of this idea that there's something missing. Now, and here's the paradox, right? If God is omnipresence, and God is all-powerful, and God is all-knowing, then God is right here where we are, and there can, in reality, be nothing missing. But the appearance is that something is missing from us, and we're seeking that which we think is missing. We're seeking God. We may not even be at the point where we're seeking God. We may be seeking material comfort. We may still be in, as Goldsmith puts it, we may still be in our materialistic state of mind, and we're trying to bring God into the material world, or use God in the material world to create a better human experience for ourselves. Exemplified by Janis Joplin's song, Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? And that's a stage that we go through. Now, at later stages we can look back and say, well, that's kind of a waste. What are you doing that for? Your happiness is not in material things. Your happiness is not in more stuff. Why are you trying to learn how to pray effectively so you can have more and better stuff in your life? But just like the baby learning how to crawl, just like the baby learning how to push itself up in the bassinet, that is a stage. That is a stage that we go through. We're in the process of learning. Dr. Holmes said it's natural that we want to do that. But after a while, we get over that. After a while, we get over that. So in that stage of our development, then our spiritual practice is really, we are learning how to pray effectively. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to learn how to pray effectively and efficiently. We hear things like, if your prayers aren't answered, it's because you've been praying amiss, and we start to wonder, what does praying amiss mean, and how can I pray better? And the typical free market viewpoint of the world, how do I get more effective, and how do I get more efficient at doing this? See, and that desire to become more effective and to become more efficient, that desire itself, like the baby's desire to raise its head up and peek out of the bassinet, that desire in itself is causing us to engage in a behavior that leads to our growth. And we have to understand that. So we talk about desires. So some of the teachings, when you get into this, say, well, you should be absent of all desires. You should not have any desires. So we say, well, then desire's bad, So then my desire becomes to have no desires. And then suddenly we realize that, well, wait a second, I still have a desire, but now my desire is to have no desires. And as long as I desire to have no desires, I still have a desire. So now I'm stuck in catch-22, you see. And what we what we have to come to recognize is there are desires that lead us, that bring us closer to God, that cause us to engage, excuse me, in the behavior and the activities that bring us closer to God, and there are desires that lead us in the other direction, lead us away. So I'll give you an example. Thirst. Thirst is a desire. And there's nothing wrong with thirst. Thirst isn't bad. Thirst isn't evil. Thirst isn't something that the devil inflicts upon you. Thirst is a normal, natural desire that causes you to drink. Now, you and I can choose what we're going to drink. We can drink something that's good for us. We can drink something that's healthful. We can drink something that builds our body, or we can drink something that is not very good for us. That choice is up to us. You and I have to decide. But the desire itself, the desire of thirst, is a good desire because it causes us to engage in something that is good for us, even though we can modify that desire into something that's not good for us through our own free will. So what Dr. Holmes tells us to do is to examine our desires and ask ourselves, does this thing that I desire give a greater expression to life or to love or to truth or to beauty? Does it rob anyone? Does it harm anyone? And if our desire passes those tests, he says, then go for it. Then go for it, you see. You're not bringing any harm into the world, and in fact, you're bringing good into the world. So go for it. So apply yourself then to doing what is appropriate at your stage of development, to learn how to bring this desire to fulfillment in your life. And like the desire of thirst, instead of drinking water, we are drinking of the Spirit, if you will. Because here's what we learn as we move out of that phase. And I just want to point out that in all areas of our life, we don't move at the same time. We don't. So we might be in one area when it comes to money, and another area when it comes to love, and another area when it comes to health, right? So we have to love ourselves enough to realize that we can have the two opposing ideas in our mind in different parts of our life at the same time, and we can still function. We can still move forward. But as we go through this stage of recognizing then that there is this power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief, and by learning how to engage in treatment, in affirmative prayer, that a change occurs within us, a change occurs within our consciousness, and when the change occurs within our consciousness, the change in our circumstances occurs. Then we start to wonder why. Why is that? As Paul said, who am I that thou art mindful of me? Why is that? Why is that? If we didn't have that experience, if we didn't have the experience of recognizing that when we pray in an affirmative manner, that prayers are answered, if we didn't have that, we would never ask why, right? We wouldn't have the background to ask why. You know, they talk of Newton discovering gravity when the apple fell from the tree, and of course that's a story, but if the apple never fell from the tree, then he would never ask why, you see. So as we are growing closer to God, we may not even realize what we're doing, but as we are growing closer to God, right, what is the first step in our prayer? First step in treatment? What do we know about God? What do we know about God as it relates to this circumstance in my life? And then what do we know about ourselves as that relates to God? See what we're doing in those first two steps? Is we're turning, as Emmett Fox says, we're turning away from the problem, we're turning to God. If you think of the Lord's Prayer, what did it start with? God is in heaven and God is our Father. What is God and what is our relationship to God? So by engaging in this act of deliberately becoming more effective and more efficient at using affirmative prayer, spiritual mind treatment, to produce changes, what we are producing is a change in our consciousness. And as we do that, then we start to wonder why. See, why is it that this works? Why is it that this power in the universe responds to me according to my beliefs? See, then we move into the next phase. And the next phase is learning and growing. And now I want to know all that I can learn about about God in whatever way is appropriate to me. And now I start to have the desire, not for things, not for stuff, not for change in circumstances. My desire truly moves into, I desire God. In the words of Augustine, I ask nothing of thee, not even thy love, I only want thee. And then our spiritual practice starts to change. Now we continue on with our treatment, but now our treatment changes. And we recognize that what we're doing is instead of trying to demonstrate things in our lives, we are trying to demonstrate a greater relationship with the power and the presence of God in our lives. Because the only way, as Holmes says, the only way that we can have the demonstration is by getting God. The flip side of that is the only reason we don't have whatever it is that we feel is missing from our lives is because of this idea of separation in our consciousness. So then what we are doing is we are deliberately tearing down the ideas of separation. That's what we're doing, right? So at the beginning we might start and say, well, I'm doing this because I want stuff. I want a better life. I want better health. I want this. I want that. I want all fine. All part of the process. And now we say, no. What I want is a greater realization of the experience and the presence of God. Seek ye first the kingdom, and all things shall be added unto you. So now I just want to know, how can I get closer to God? What are the spiritual practices that lead me into a greater experience of the presence of God? And now we start to move more into meditation. We don't stop affirmative prayer. We don't stop spiritual mind treatment. But now our desire becomes more to simply be still and know. Be still and know. We are now in the walking phase. Crawl, walk, run. We are now in the walking stage. Now, when we as human beings, when we start to cross that threshold from level 1 to level 2, as I call them, sometimes there is this conflict. There is this problem of entertaining the two ideas at the same time and still functioning. In other words, we move into level 2 and we want to go back and say, well, level 1 was all wrong. And we have to be able to look back and say, level 1 was just perfect. Level 1 was just perfect for where I was at that time in my growth. So now we start to move into more of a learning, more of a reading, more of a knowing. And at first that knowing is knowing from what other people have written, what other people have said. We are reading about other people's experiences of the presence of God. But eventually that changes to, we want to know it from within for ourselves. We want to know it from what our heart knows. Not what our intellect knows, not what our ego knows, but what our heart knows. So this becomes a period of being still and knowing, and finding the right way for us to do that. There are probably thousands of different techniques for meditation, and we can try many of them, but we have to find one that works, and we have to stick with it. See, at that first stage, we are developing discipline. We are developing the ability to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. And if we try to move into the second stage and we don't have the ability to do what needs to be done, we don't have the ability to sit in meditation. And think of the Eastern practice of yoga, physical yoga. Why do they do the physical yoga? They do the physical yoga so the body can sit in the meditation position for hours at a time. You have to have the discipline to develop the body in order to create that platform where they can sit for hours in meditation. So we get to that second level and our spiritual tools in our toolbox start to change. We become more interested, not necessarily in what other people tell us about the experience of God to be, but we become more interested in availing ourselves to that experience. And as we stay with that, now as I say, we still continue on with our treatment, but perhaps our intention of our treatment has changed from the material thing to the spiritual realization. And now, in the second level, we just want to be still and know. We want to listen to that inner guidance. We want to listen to our heart telling us, Dear Lord, what is the way today? How today may I love you? How today may I serve you? How today may I move closer to you? See? I'm moving to a different stage of the path. And then eventually, over time, and as I say, it may not be this one lifetime, it may be over God knows how long it takes us to get there, but we will all get there. We get to what we're told in the book of Revelation, which is we get to the actual realization of the experience of the presence of God. We are there, and now we are free of desire, you see. We don't have to desire the experience of God because we are experiencing the presence of God. We don't have to desire circumstances in our lives because whatever is right and appropriate is there. Now you can't imagine God sitting wherever you imagine God, but if you take the old image of a old man with a white beard sitting on a throne, can you imagine God getting up and saying, I desire this, I desire that, I need this, I need that? The desire is more in the form of expressing the joy. So when we get to that third level, then we are expressing the joy, and whatever needs must be they are taken care of. Now when we're at level 1, we say, how can that be? I don't understand. I've got to work hard for every nickel I make. When we're at level 2, we say, but if I had the right level of consciousness, then everything would unfold. And when we're at level 3, we say, level 1 and level 2, you're both right. You're both right. Stay on the path. Stay on the path. And you will get there. There's no conflict. Level 3 entertains all of the seeming opposite ideas and still has the ability to function. So I invite you this week, try the different tools in your spiritual toolbox. Try them. Recognize that each one is perfect in its place and in its time. And you have to mix up. You have to mix up your spiritual practices. Right? You have to keep trying different things because you are constantly changing as you are on your path. You may do more meditation one day and more treatment another day. You may just do none of the above and be completely mindful on the third day. Without even trying, you may just be in that state of bliss and awareness and oneness. But pay attention to where you are. Work at your level. Right? Dr. Holmes and Emmett Fox both say you cannot go beyond your level. So you can't have a desire and say, I don't have any desires because having desires is not spiritual. That's fooling yourself. What you have to say is, I do understand this desire. But I understand it is a desire to know God more fully in some way, and I will pursue it in that manner. And if we can't even get there, then we say, no, it's a desire for stuff, and I will pursue it in that manner. But wherever you are is okay in that area of your life, at that day, at that time. But be mindful of it. Be aware of it. Try different spiritual practices. Try the different 5-step and 7-steps processes of treatment. Try those. Try different meditation techniques. Try visualization, which Dr. Holmes tells us is a visual treatment. Try different things. Listen to your heart. Let the love of God call you home in a manner that is appropriate for you. We have freedom of choice. Now, freedom of choice doesn't mean that we can define the curriculum. It just means that we define when we're going to take it. I invite you, let this be the week that you earnestly examine where you are in taking your curriculum and what steps are appropriate for you at this stage of your growth, at this stage of your development. And do them, implement them, take your time. And so it is. And even though Reverend Laurie picked out a treatment for me, I left it over on the other counter. So we're going to do our own closing treatment today. As we come together today, let us recognize that God is perfect, whole, and complete. And as expressions of divine love, we too must be perfect, whole, and complete. We may not yet recognize it. We may not yet experience it. But we are perfect, whole, and complete. The all-knowing universe, the all-knowing, all-loving God within us is this day guiding each and every one of us to the next step on our spiritual path. Before we do anything, we check in with our heart. We follow the love. And God's love will never lead us astray. We are grateful for the time together this morning. We are grateful to know there's a power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief. And we release this treatment to that perfect law, knowing so certainly it is done, that we say together, and so it is.